Back when I was in college, I used to work evening shifts in an independent coffee shop that happened to be right next door to this little bagel place. I think there must have been some degree of collusion between the two owners, as the bagel place was geared to be like a health nut place, whereas all the baked goods the coffee shop produced had like diabetes-inducing levels of sugar in them. So naturally, I'd often call into the bagel place to grab a bite to eat before clocking in for my shift, since the sugar crash that followed one of our cinnamon buns was about as debilitating as they come. But that's how I met Tom. Tom worked full-time at the bagel place, and he was there to take my order like 9 out of 10 times that I stopped by. It wasn't long before he knew my orders off by heart. Shortly after that, we were on first-name terms, and the more familiar we got, the more a little gentle flirting entered into our daily exchanges. I wasn't mad about it. He was kinda cute, and it certainly didn't sting that he started giving me discounts. After about a month or so, he asked if I have a boyfriend. I say no, so he asked me if I'd like to grab a drink or something after our shift ends. The bagel place and the coffee shop closed within a half hour of each other. I said sure, because why not, right? But oh my god, if I'd have known what kind of guy Tom was, I'd have just resigned myself to getting fat from the danishes at work. A few extra pounds would be easy to shake, but a full-blown stalker, not so much. Okay, so I didn't meet Tom after work that day, as I was way too busy with an upcoming deadline. However, we did arrange to meet over the weekend so we could see if we clicked. It definitely wasn't the greatest date I'd ever been on. Like, I don't think whatever chemistry we had really translated into a social conversational setting, but I didn't write him off altogether, and we agreed to go out next time we were both free. It's so weird to think that he actually gave me space at first. Like, we went 48 hours at a time without talking sometimes. He really did seem chill. But then came the day when I walked into the bagel place and the manager was working the evening shift. This was highly out of the ordinary, so I asked her if Tom was sick or something. It's then she hits me with, "Tom isn't employed here anymore. We decided it was best that we parted ways." I'm shocked. So while I'm waiting for my order, I text Tom to ask him what the heck happened with this parting ways business. He replies pretty quickly, telling me that the manager had caught him giving me a discount and had fired him as a result. Immediately, I felt terribly guilty, and I get the idea that if I pay off the difference for what was owed, I could maybe talk her into giving him his job back. So right when I collect my bagel, I politely offer to pay back the discount if she'd consider offering Tom his job back. I kind of embellish a little, make out that I'm the one who manipulated him into doing it, and the whole time the manager has this wow expression on her face. Right as I think I'm making a solid point, she comes back with, "Oh, is that what he told you?" According to her, Tom hadn't been fired for giving discounts. It was her own policy that employees of local businesses get money off their food. He'd been fired because she'd received a number of complaints from female customers regarding his behavior towards them. His MO was to flirt a little, offer discounts, then eventually ask for their number. Those who handed it over didn't have a problem. Those that refused got cussed out before he refused service altogether. She claimed she actually had security footage of him going off on a customer, and some of the language he used was absolutely abhorrent. She'd planned on giving him a final warning over the incidents, as she prefers to work with and mentor junior staff instead of just kicking them to the curb. But the one thing she can't deal with is liars. And not realizing the footage came with audio too, Tom tried to lie his way out of the predicament by claiming the disagreement was because the lady had tried to give him a fake $10 bill. That's like a pathological level of dishonesty right there, still insisting on the lies when confronted with overwhelming evidence to the contrary. I just remembered apologizing for the intrusion and thanked her for setting me straight before I headed over to work to clock in. Tom was still expecting a reply at that point, but I just had no idea what to say to him. I wasn't even sure if I was ever going to talk to him again. I mean, that could have been me getting cussed out if I had the gall to turn him down. When I finished my shift, I got my phone out of my purse to find that I had a grand total of 12 different notifications. all with Tom's name attached. They started off all gentle at first. Have a good shift, text me when you finish, etc. But around 8 p.m., there was obviously a point where he'd learn of the interaction between me and his former manager, and he was not happy about that. Not one bit. Oh, so you're just going to believe the exploitative employer over the person she's just taken advantage of? This is exactly what's wrong with the American labor market. Even the workers are bootlickers, was the general tone of his messages. I'm not even saying I entirely disagree, but the whole thing left such a bad taste in my mouth that I wasn't interested in seeing him at all. When I got home from work, I blocked Tom's number, deleted my contact details, and figured that that would be that. But oh, how wrong I was. A few days later, I'm working the evening shift, crouched down stocking the mini fridge. I finish up, close the fridge, then when I stand up and turn around, Tom stood at the register. I try to be as warm and friendly as possible, asking how he's been and stuff, but I completely avoid the fact that we haven't spoken since his little text tirade. At first, I think I've dodged a bullet, as he's perfectly civil and goes on to order a drink. But like right as I'm handing him his drink, he decides to make it super awkward. So, I guess you're pretty much done with me, huh? He didn't say it in a particularly aggressive way, but it was loud and jarring enough to attract the attention of almost everyone in the store. I feel like I'm about to cringe out of existence, but somehow I maintain my corporeal form and say in as low a voice as possible, "This isn't the time or the place. Please, drop it." He just smiles, nods, and starts walking away. But instead of actually walking out of the door like I thought he was going to, he just takes a seat right in the middle of the store and proceeds to just stare at the register area in between baby sips of his coffee. And that's basically how it started. Tom would show up for coffee almost every time I was working, and every time he'd just sit there for like an hour, staring me down whenever I was at the register. He was never rude or awkward about it, not after the initial incident anyway. So despite the fact that my boss had assured me that any funny business would result in a lifetime ban, he was reluctant to kick him out for being a little weird, as he phrased it. There got to be a kind of running joke about it too. Everyone called him Vicky's Stalker, and I have to admit that the one about upselling him Portuguese custard tarts until he was too fat to chase me, that one really did make me smile. But boy did that stop being funny after the first time he followed me home. After that, things got serious. I called the cops, got some advice from their fixated persons unit, and they actually paid Tom a visit to warn him off stalking me. But apparently he was only deterred for about a week, and what followed was a painfully slow escalation of intensity that culminated in the following. Out of the 24 times he'd followed me up till that point, Tom had either stayed on the street corner and watched me walk into my building, or stood outside the building and looked up at the windows like he was trying to work out exactly which unit I was in. But on the day in question, I was so used to him keeping his distance that I didn't even notice that he was almost right behind me by the time I got to my door. Seeing him so close actually elicited a kind of squeal from me. One I'm definitely not proud of, but Jesus Christ, seeing him right there just about scared the poop out of me. I absolutely bolted inside, never being so grateful that the lock was operated by a key fob instead of an actual key. Tom just stayed at the door, banging on it and telling me to get my butt out there, that I had to be an adult and talk to him about it, whatever it was. Since he was banging on the door and screaming in the street, I was totally freaking out, and naturally my first move is to call the cops. But I think he was banging so hard, acting like I was the only one inside, because the building I live in at the time looked exactly like all the other family homes in the block. To him, I could have quite easily been the only person living there, only that wasn't quite the case. I had the top floor of the house while the bottom floor was occupied entirely by this Puerto Rican guy who worked night shifts. Keep in mind that this whole thing is going on a Saturday afternoon, smack bang in the middle of this guy's sleeping time. So while I'm praying for the cops to show up in time, an unlikely savior is about to come to my rescue. So, imagine you're me. All you can hear is, "Vicky, if you think you can just punk guys like me and not face the consequences, you're dumber than you look." Bang, bang, bang. Then out of nowhere, an even deeper, louder voice starts booming over the first like, "Hey, are you crazy? I'm trying to sleep here." My neighbor from downstairs, whose name actually turned out to be Lewis, is wearing nothing but a pair of shorts, and he's screaming in Tom's face as he backs up down the steps of our building. Tom starts saying something back to him, but Lewis keeps shouting over him, telling him to get lost, yet it doesn't seem like he's interested in backing down just yet. Then again, out of nowhere I hear Lewis say, "Oh, you gonna tase me, bro?" Before the confrontation gets physical. Everyone else in the street is fixated on the fistfight that's now going down, but all I can focus on is what Lewis said. Tase me. Tom had brought a taser, presumably to use on me. Now by that point, because the cops were getting calls about the fight on top of my stalking complaint, a marked patrol car rolls onto the scene, with a by now bloodied Tom trying to walk away from the scene. The cops initially go for Lewis, drawing their guns and demanding a show of hands, but he responds with, "Hey, I'm the victim here. This guy just tried to tase me." The cops and I watch as Tom starts to walk faster away from the scene, which obviously prompts the cops to chase him down and arrest him for carrying a concealed weapon or whatever they had in mind. Finally, my stalker was in police custody, only wouldn't catch charges for the actual stalking. He ended up going to jail for the one thing cops could stick to him, the contents of his backpack. On the one day that Tom had decided to act on his little fixation and move in to take me or whatever, he'd come with a pre-prepared kidnap kit, along with a few other choice items. According to the detective I spoke to after the fact, Tom had chosen to confront me that day while carrying duct tape, a length of electrical cord, a kind of retractable baton, and a box of 100 different contraceptives. For some reason, it's that last part that particularly creeped me out. Not so much their inclusion, but the sheer freaking number of them. At his trial for conspiracy to commit kidnapping, Tom's attorney argued the state was trying to wrongfully prosecute a man who's been unfortunate enough to be assaulted by an unhinged parolee whilst carrying nothing more malicious than home supplies. The prosecution had a different story. Not only had they obtained CCTV images of Tom showing up at my job on a total of 31 separate occasions over the course of 2 months, but a search of his home had turned up some extremely disturbing discoveries. What Tom had in his backpack that day was just a fraction of the kidnap kit that he'd assembled. He had all kinds of handcuffs, ankle cuffs, ring gags, and latex masks, but by far the most disturbing were the surgical tools and the sevoflurane canister face mask combo. Yeah, I had to ask what sevoflurane was too, and turns out it's similar to chloroform, that knock you out stuff that you put on rags. He had tons of creepy stuff on his hard drive, including guides to kidnapping, hiding, and eventually breaking his prospective victims through a combination of brainwashing and beating. He also had a bunch of foreign language comic books that seemed to focus heavily on carnal torture, I suppose you could say. The prosecution just piled on all this evidence until it was quite clear to both the judge and jury that Tom was an extremely dangerous individual. I was terrified he'd escape justice via some loophole or something. Maybe he'd have rich parents who could pay for some smart lawyer, but no. Not even his clean rap sheet saved him from getting a solid 22-year sentence for conspiracy to commit kidnapping. As you can imagine, it was quite an ordeal, and I had to make a number of court appearances to confirm that I was one of the subjects of his many fixations. It was the most stressful experience of my life, without a shadow of a doubt, and a part of me wonders just how many of those 22 years he'll really end up doing. And when he does get out, will he really have changed? Or am I going to be walking up my driveway one day when I feel a hand on my shoulder? Am I going to turn around and see the face of a man who wants to finish what he started. I met my first serious boyfriend in my final year of college, and the first few months of our relationship were some of the happiest times of my life. Little did I know that our breakup the following year would result in him basically stalking me for 4 years afterwards. He made my life absolute torture for almost 5 times as long as we were actually a couple. And over time, someone I loved most in the world became someone I hated and feared with all my heart. A few months into our relationship, he started to display some increasingly possessive and controlling behavior. It was subtle at first. He'd asked if I'd done my workouts, then gently chide me if I'd been too busy to do them. He'd insist on knowing exactly what I was doing on any given day, and he repeatedly made comments on whatever I was eating, exclusively positive reinforcement, but that somehow made the whole thing even creepier. The fact that he was treating me more like a child or a pet than a girlfriend. I didn't just want to jump ship. I was really into him, and practically every young adult novel I'd read involving romance recommended honesty and communication. So, that's what I tried to do. Just warn him off that kind of controlling or patronizing behavior because it was super off-putting. At first, he seemed like he was completely incapable of taking any criticism regarding his behavior, which was yet another red flag. Yet when I assured him I'd be packing my bags if he didn't start treating me like an adult, he relented and promised to be better, but not without what was essentially a miniature temper tantrum. I just put it down to the shock of me threatening to leave. Like, it had upset me just to think about too, but still, if I'd have been as wise and world-weary as I am now, I'd have left him as soon as he began to beg. For about a month after, he was true to his word. He stopped being so possessive and let me live my life unhindered. Yet slowly but surely he started acting in the same old way, and that's when it became clear that it wasn't so much that he couldn't change, he just didn't want to. I knew the only way to proceed was to just be brave and break up with him so I could move on with my life. The breakup in itself was pathetic in the extreme. He cried and screamed and begged to the point where I wondered where the man I fell in love with had disappeared to. It took a while, but in the end he accepted. A full week went by without us talking, and I honestly thought that was the end of it. But as it turned out, it was only the beginning. At first, when we got back in contact, his behavior and demeanor seemed like nothing more than the regular pining of a spurned lover. He'd tell me he missed me, get angry when I didn't reply and send a wall of abusive text, then follow up by sending gifts to my job, like embarrassing me in front of my coworkers was somehow going to suddenly win me over. I thought this might last for a week or two at most. If I just maintained my policy of no contact, then he'd eventually lose interest and move on. But he didn't. Every time his texts and calls died down long enough for me to start hoping, they'd start right back up again as frantic as ever. It was a real pain to change my phone number, but in the end, I had no choice. For a while, that brought a measure of peace, but instead of giving up, my ex just upped his game. It started when I just so happened to bump into him at the Publix near my apartment. I put the first encounter down to chance, but he didn't make a scene or anything. We just exchanged looks and moved on. But then I started bumping into him on the way home from work too, and whenever I took my dog for a walk, and whenever I went for a run. And I realized it was never just us bumping into one another. He was actually stalking me. Confronting him about it did nothing, and the restraining order I filed was rejected until I returned with photo evidence of us bumping into one another at a multitude of different locations. But even when I got it approved by a judge, he kept the minimum distance of 100 feet, just watching me from afar. He basically was saying to me, I could do anything I want. I'm right here, and you're right there. And when that message finally came through, I knew I had to just pack my life up and move across the city. I even managed to get a transfer to a different branch of the company I worked for. But still, he somehow managed to track me down. I repeated the entire process a couple of months later, only this time, I moved entire cities. Granted, the other city was only like 50 miles away, so I could easily visit friends and family on weekends, but it was still a big move. Honestly, though, I was willing to do whatever it took at that point to be rid of my ex, and that meant purging my online presence too. Yet somehow, he kept getting a hold of my number and my address. Like it got to the point where I became intensely paranoid, getting it into my head that a close friend or family member was passing on my information, maybe for money, maybe out of fear for their safety. I actually threatened to sue the company that prints out state phone books, and they insisted that they delisted me, but still I kept getting calls from my ex. Towards the end of the 4th year, I couldn't sleep, I couldn't eat, I couldn't concentrate at work. I was a shadow of my former self. And it all crept up so slowly that I didn't realize how bad things had gotten until I fainted at work. I was offered long-term sick leave, but since the sick pay wouldn't be nearly enough to actually cover my expenses, I had no choice but to carry on with my life, even though I feared it might end at any moment as a result of my own poor health. Just then, 2 months shy of his stalking having lasted a full 5 years, a friend of mine forwarded me a news story involving misuse of resources at the National Tax Office. Staff members were using insider knowledge to find themselves and their immediate families enough tax loopholes to pay a trifling amount each year, which was obviously highly illegal. But one of the names listed in the story was one I was very, very familiar with. It was my ex, and although there was every chance he was committing the same tax fraud as the others, I knew he was abusing his position for another reason entirely. That's how, no matter how hard I tried to move on with my life, he was always able to get a hold of my updated contact details by looking up my freaking tax returns and other such paperwork. He and his coworkers were looking at lengthy prison sentences for what they'd done, and it seemed like finally I'd get the peace I'd been craving for so long. It might only be for a number of years until he could get out and find me again, but at least it would provide some measure of relief. Little did I know that this peace would turn out to be permanent, as my ex obviously couldn't face the time. He took his own life before his sentencing hearing. I'm not ashamed to say that I wept with utter relief once I heard the news. I know that sounds cruel, but you have to put yourself in my shoes. That man made my life the worst it's ever been for the longest time it's ever been that way. He made any kind of romantic relationship impossible, and those were the best dating years of my life, just burned away because he couldn't handle seeing me with anyone else. He wasn't sad at the losses he'd caused me, so I won't be sad about the losses he'd caused himself. It was throughout his own pathological stubborn and possessiveness that he came to find himself in such a situation. And if you ask me, he got everything he deserved. Everything. Back when I was a junior in high school, this guy transferred in from out of state who developed a serious obsession with me. It started out kind of harmless at first. He would try talking to me, but only ever about the weirdest stuff. Like if he'd been all sweet about asking me out, I definitely would have felt guilty turning him down, but because he was so obnoxious, I had zero qualms with telling him to get lost. A good example would be the first time I rejected him. Most guys might just take it in their stride, maybe think I was playing hard to get, but this kid heard my no and immediately just punched a locker right next to me. The sound of it had me jumping out of my skin, and the few doubts I had about rejecting him completely evaporated the moment he acted out like that. He didn't just punch the locker either, because he caused such a scene, he literally ran away from the lockers at full speed. It was seriously the most embarrassing and terrifying thing that had ever happened to me at that point. Well, at the hands of another human being anyway. He did seem to take a few steps back following this little outburst, but he soon redoubled his efforts, joining every after-school club I was a member of. When they were done, he'd follow me home at a distance. One time my dad caught him doing it and chased him up the street after that. It became this huge family issue. I just found the whole thing thoroughly mortifying. I guess because I just didn't get how serious it was. It was annoying, kind of scary even, but I didn't think he had what it took to actually hurt me. But as it turned out, that wasn't really the issue. After a few months of my turning down dates, he told me if I didn't want to go out with him, that he would take his own life. I still said no. I found stuff like that sort of emotional blackmail, to be frankly disgusting, and instead of having its intended effect to garner my sympathy, I hated this kid more than ever. The whole feeling was grounded in the idea that he just wouldn't do anything, that he didn't have the guts, the balls. He was all empty threats and grand theatrical displays, or so I thought. The next few days, he was missing from school. Rumors were around that he actually did take his own life, and I'd be lying if I said it didn't freak me out think he actually had gone through and done it. I mean, that'd be something that'd stay with me for the rest of my life. A kid told me he'd end himself if I didn't date him. I didn't, so he did. But God, if I didn't feel like punching him in the face as soon as he showed up again, I figured he'd just skip school for a few days to scare me a little bit. Mission accomplished. And this confirmed that he didn't have the balls to do it. He was wearing bandages when he showed up again and actually cornered me at lunch to say, "You made me do this." I just ignored him. I didn't want to actually ask to see the cuts, but a part of me is still so effing sure that they were covering up nothing at all. But the next big incident was at the end of our senior year. After a club meeting, I stayed behind to help clean up. My friend had stepped out to go grab something from their lockers, so I didn't see my stalker walk back into the room. He must have just saw his opportunity, came up behind me, and grabbed my chest. I don't remember what he said, but I was so freaked out that I actually squealed. That's the point I got the cops involved. As the room's security camera captured the whole thing, the whole ordeal ended up in court. He got a conviction, and I think his handsiness actually cost him his place at his preferred college too. It was a little piece of revenge that I cherished, but it turned out it just gave him a whole bunch of free time that he could use to stalk me. I became absolutely paranoid with him hanging around my college campus, and by that stage he was exhibiting every possible behavior of a controlling, manipulative sociopath. I just remember being terrified that he'd eventually try something worse. I finally transferred schools, and about a year later, I started getting emails from him, most of which were apologies for how mean he was to me and asking if I forgave him. But the emails quickly turned into him begging for my Facebook info. I had him blocked on Facebook since high school, and I absolutely didn't want him to know where I was going to school, so I ended up blocking him on my email too. Since then, I've not heard from him again, and I have also moved across the country for another reason entirely. But the move honestly brought me a lot of relief that I wouldn't accidentally run into him sometime, and the whole cycle might start again. Yes, I've actually had a stalker, and I'm one of the rare and unfortunate male victims of what legally is known as a fixated person. It all began when I first started my career as a radio DJ whilst in my early 20s. It was only for a local radio station that covered my home city and the surrounding area, so the show I ran wasn't nearly as widely received as national or digital stations, but we still got a couple of 100,000 listeners a day, and let me tell you, that was still a rush knowing so many people could hear my voice. Like most radio stations, we ran a lot of phone-in style segments and competitions for our listeners. And it was through interacting with the public that I came to earn myself a few regular callers. Not quite people I'll call fans, since saying that about myself is way too cringy, but they were definitely people we relished talking to since they generated such excellent content. For example, there was this one older black lady, Phyllis. She had to be in her 60s or 70s. We got talking about how she was never married, a little playful flirting ensued, and before I know it, The segment is going viral on local social media and beyond. I have to admit, the segments were hilarious, and for the most part, I enjoyed my interactions with our callers. But there was one girl who reminded me that being in the public eye, or ear in my case, can have some serious drawbacks. The girl only ever called in to try and talk to me, interrupting competitions or call-in events and generally making a nuisance of herself. We started screening her calls, but she just found ways to call from different numbers, using a different name and sometimes a different voice so she'd be able to get through undetected. It got to the stage where our producer actually took over on one of the calls off air, warning her that we'd have her charged with harassment if she didn't stop calling. That kind of worked, but it also kind of really didn't too. She stopped calling all right, but instead, she just started showing up in the parking lot and trying to talk to me after I got off work. She tracked me down at public appearances, caused all kinds of beef on our social media pages, and even picketed the entrance to the station, telling everyone who passed what a-holes we were. Over time, her behavior went from innocent but irritating to outright vicious. She was not happy that we'd banned her from calling in, but instead of blaming the producer, everything involving the show was his call and his alone, she blamed me. She was so mad about it too. I'm talking frighteningly irate, and as soon as my producer heard about it, he pretty much marched me down to the police department to file a complaint. He had 30 years of experience. He dealt with people stalking his DJs before, and it was honestly chilling when he said something along the lines of, "Look, either you deal with this now, or it gets worse and worse until she eventually murders you. And since I don't have the time or the emotional capacity for that, we're going to the cops." I figured it'd be a relatively short and simple process of filing a report, maybe a court date to file a restraining order or something. But as soon as we mentioned who the stalker was, the cops taking our statements looked up as if the name was familiar to him. My producer straight up asked him if she was involved with stalking prior to myself, and although he didn't give us a concrete answer, telling us that he'd put us in touch with a couple of detectives ASAP, that spoke volumes. The next day, I get a call from a detective telling me he was from something called the FTA, or the Fixated Threat Assessment Department. Basically, they're the cops who deal with stalkers before they work themselves up to actually hurting their victim, and these guys had dealt with my stalker on a number of previous occasions. In fact, she was something of a regular customer of theirs, and they had some very, very bad news for me. Some stalkers remain a benign irritation for their victims, too obsessive to not let go, but too shy to actually act on their fixation. My stalker was not one of those. She had a distinct pattern to her behavior, and that consisted of her getting very violent, very quickly. She'd managed to avoid outright incarceration because most of the crimes she committed were low-level property damage or theft. But she definitely had a potential for actual bodily harm. One of her victims was subject to an attack in which she tried to spray industrial-strength solvent into the guy's eyes. I'm not sure how much permanent damage that would have done, but there was a clear intention to take his sight away from him for good. That's when I actually started to get scared. She was smaller than me, weaker than me, probably slower than me, but she still presented an actual risk. I couldn't remain vigilant and protect myself 24/7, and if I wanted to remain working on a public platform, I was just going to have to man up and accept that certain risks came with that. I came to the decision that I wasn't going to squander my radio career just because of one crazy. It had been my absolute dream since I was old enough to work the dials of my dad's car stereo. It was a hill worth dying on, even if the metaphor might someday turn literal. At that point, I got back in touch with the FTA cop to find out what came next. The one thing she didn't know about me was where I lived, and I intended to keep it that way. And what came next was like something out of a spy novel. A plainclothes cop came over to my apartment to teach me what amounted to counter-surveillance. It was all stuff you might imagine, varying my routines home from work, making random turns and doubling back on myself, varying my schedule so a person wouldn't be able to track me by my schedule. Basically, I had to break up any kind of patterns in my life. I know that doesn't sound like much, but trust me, try planning your entire life around a violent stalker for 3 months. You'll see what it does. The lack of actual control over everything, feeling like everything I said or did might be compromised, or how the toxicity of it seeped into my interpersonal relationships, how it made having any kind of romantic life completely impossible. It doesn't feel so bad at first. The problem is, it creeps up on you. You don't even know the stress is there until one day you wake up to an extremely painful rash on your ribcage, one so painful you need actual opioid painkillers to deal with. Stress-induced shingles, my doctor called it, and asked me if I had anything weighing on my mind. The question was so on the nose that I actually laughed a bit before I answered. Thankfully, she never did figure out where I lived. Then one day, it just kind of stopped. No more following, no more phone calls, no more anything. Apparently, a radio station across town had hired a new guy and she became fixated on him. Once I found that out, I called and gave him a friendly heads up, basically giving him the same advice my producer gave me. Look, either you deal with this now, or it gets worse and worse until she eventually murders you. And since I don't have the time or the emotional capacity for that, we're going to the cops. I only write this because I think it might give people an idea of the kind of thinking that goes on inside the head of a stalker. So, although I've never been stalked, my past is littered with behavior that people might call obsessive and controlling. There are many different kinds of stalking, you see, and in professional terms, not all obsessive or fixated behavior really qualifies as stalking. I suppose what I'm really trying to say with this opening is, I used to be a stalker, and this is my story. I first began to experience feelings of fixation in my first year of old sixth form college. There was this girl named Emma who sat opposite me in English class. All the desks were arranged in a kind of horseshoe shape, and I used to stare at her from across the room, sometimes so deeply that I'd disassociate and be unable to remember a thing the teacher had said. I always tried to avoid getting caught, of course. The last thing I wanted was to scare her. I thought I was in love, you see, and I suppose in my mind I was just gearing up to ask her out. But it wasn't about sharing her company for a few hours on a date somewhere. No. I wanted to own her. I needed her to be mine. I played it cool enough to get her number during spring term, and I called her one night after school to try to arrange a date. She didn't answer her phone, so I just kept calling and calling, thinking if she wanted to arrange a date, she'd answer eventually, right? This is back when I was still using my parents' landline to call people, so I'm hitting the redial button over and over again whenever the line went dead. I didn't see anything wrong with it. I didn't think for a moment that seeing the missed call count tick over into double digits would freak her out. And what's more, I just couldn't help myself either. Like I sort of knew I was being a bit impatient and that maybe I should chill, but still, I just couldn't stop calling. As you can imagine, my pursuit of Emma came to absolutely nothing, but I think I was too fresh to really do anything about it, other than remain a doting admirer from afar. And besides, it wasn't all that long before I was off to university, which brought a whole campus's worth of new girls to obsess over. The next girl, Jay, lived in the same halls of residence as me, just a few doors down from my room. She was the sweetest, most beautiful creature I'd ever laid my eyes on, and I got those exactly same feelings of wanting to own her as I did from Emma from English class. Only this time, they were considerably more intense. Not so much because I liked her any more or less than Emma, but being at university gave me this almost subconscious sense that I could do anything I wanted. There were no teachers watching us, no camera in our dorm rooms to watch us while we slept. She was mine for the taking. And it's that kind of predatory behavior that I've learned to recognize in myself, and I have to work very hard to see it sometimes, as it's just second nature to think that way. That's why I'm so different from other people, I suppose. They have this little angel on their shoulder to counter the devil on the other, whereas I just have two devils that are disguised as their more celestial cousins. I figured the best way to win her over was to find out as much as I could about her, then employ that knowledge in a way that would impress her. So when I added her on Facebook and proceeded to pore over her posts and picture histories, I told myself it was a noble pursuit. I was putting in work that would eventually result in her being extremely, extremely happy. I mean, if someone took the time to get to know what I loved most, then got me a present based on that, I'd be over the moon. My therapist has said this is somewhat true, but then asked if I could see where I went wrong picking Jay's present. At first I couldn't, but now I can. Let me see if you can too. So like I said, I spent hours at a time obsessing over her social media. Every single thing she posted, shared, retweeted, or liked going back years on a variety of different accounts. I saw it all and I made notes of every pertinent piece of information. But above all, I recognized how close she'd been with a grandma who'd passed away in her early teens. Every year on a particular date, Jay would post something about her Nana. It usually came with an old picture of her, sometimes with a baby Jay included too. This is how I noticed that Jay's grandmother kept a large variety of stuffed animals in her home, and one in particular seemed to be Jay's favorite. It was an old, scabby-looking handmade woolen doll, one with raggedy red dress and a missing eye. But perhaps its most defining feature were the tumbles of white woolen hair that came spilling from the top of the doll's head. This was probably why it was Jay's favorite, and one of the pictures was a collage of photos showing her tying a baby blue ribbon into the doll's hair. The caption read something like, "Rest in peace, Nana, GBNF. Still wish I had my Molly doll. It reminds me of you so much. XXXX. Bingo. The perfect gift idea, I thought. Surely if someone managed to get her a similar looking doll, complete with the blue ribbon, she'd fall head over heels for them. I mean, how could you not? It had to be the most thoughtful gift in the history of gifts. Since I had some money left over from Christmas, I got to work looking for someone who could make me a similar kind of doll. Giving online vendors an idea of what I wanted was easy enough, after all. I think I had about 6 or 7 quite clear photographs of it. You'd be shocked at how easy it was, honestly. There are lots of little artists out there who are more than happy to work commissions, especially when there's such a rich digital record to work with. I had my replica Molly doll within a month of me first inquiring about it, and my God, it was perfect. It looked very new, obviously, not nearly as aged and time-worn as the original, and the artist had done a very good job of it otherwise. Then once the baby blue ribbon was tied in its hair, the transformation was complete. It looked so much like the original, it was frightening. Emphasis on frightening, though, and you'll see what I mean in a minute. Since me and Jay were on quite friendly terms, I didn't think anything would mind if I snuck into her room to drop off her present. If anyone confronted me, I could just show them the bag, explain it was a surprise present, something from her youth she'd really love, and hey, presto, who's going to stop a thing like that from happening? Not a soul saw me as I walked down the hall and knocked on her door. We very rarely locked those doors back then, and it was a real community way of living, so even when we went out, we'd leave them open for people to pop in, borrow something, drop off a DVD they'd borrowed, whatever. In short, I'm practically buzzing with excitement because she's going to walk into her room and see Molly doll sat on her bed, looking right up at her. I had to wait an entire afternoon before Jay came back from lectures, and I was practically shaking with excitement by the time I heard her walking down the hall. But when she opened up her door, I didn't hear any happy, surprised sounds. I just heard screaming and crying. By the time I had the guts to emerge from my room, Jay was crying her eyes out in her friend's room. I mean, she was utterly inconsolable. I didn't know what I'd done wrong at the time, and my therapist says that realizing what I did wrong is a huge part of my treatment plan. There's just one thing I don't tell him, though. One thing I keep quiet about out of pure shame. Jay had been so freaked out by the Molly doll not because it reminded her of her Nana, not because it was such a sudden surprise to see something she'd thought was forever lost. It was the fact that even though Jay was just 11 years old when her Nana passed, she requested that she be buried with the Molly doll. Her logic being that it could keep Nana company until she could join her in heaven. Just about the sweetest thing my therapist had ever heard. I think it's kind of dumb, but I also understand that that's a problem with me, and not a problem with her, or anyone else who harbors sentimental feelings. Eventually, I told Jay the truth about who bought the doll. She was so angry that she punched me in the nose, which made me so angry that I wanted to kill her. I don't mean that in some abstract metaphorical way. I mean, I was out buying a plastic tarp to wrap her body in when I had a kind of come-to-Jesus moment, as the Americans say. The rest is history, I suppose, and here I am, on a plethora of different prescription antipsychotics, just trying to mimic the life of a normal human being. It's not been easy, coming to terms with who or what I am, but it's been worth it. I don't want to live like that anymore. I can't. Because if I allow myself to, I know it'll only be a matter of time before I hurt someone in a way that can never, ever be fixed. I had a stalker in secondary school. Well, not quite the follow you everywhere and make a shrine out of your hair kind of stalker, but enough to make me feel afraid for my safety on an almost daily basis. It made for a fairly terrifying 2 years before my mom got married and we moved to the complete other side of London. He was this huge rugby player, very handsome and extremely popular, so of course there were absolutely no social repercussions for him, and people basically refused to believe that he'd pay any attention to me at all, let alone anything remotely abusive. When he started obsessing over me, most everyone brushed it off or made excuses for him, but it quickly became an absolute nightmare. He was always making comments towards me, pinching or pulling my hair when no one else was looking. It was creepy because he obviously didn't want anyone to really know what he was doing. He knew it was disturbed, and he knew it would make him look bad if it all came to light. Sometimes he'd say things like, "I can smell you. You're about to be on your period," or "nice and clean." Always in the creepiest, perviest way imaginable, as if it couldn't get more obvious that he was enjoying it. One of the scariest moments I can recall is when I was scanning the vending machine one morning before class trying to figure out what to have for breakfast. He came up behind me, placed his hands on my waist, pushed me right up against the machine and said very clearly in my ear, "One day, I'm going to kidnap you, take you to the forest, tie you up, and screw you until you want it." That was 3 weeks before our move date, and the only thing that stopped me from going to the head teacher was the fact that it wouldn't be long until I never had to deal with this guy ever again. But I now know that that was the complete wrong approach. Even if you manage to escape someone like that, they just pick a new victim, and another, and another. They only stop victimizing women when they're actually confronted by authority figures, and even then they might be psycho enough to just carry on. So please, if anything like this happens to you, report it to the relevant authorities. Even school staff take stuff like that really, really seriously and won't hesitate to get the police involved if they think that's the right course of action. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. And if you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit r/letsreadofficial or email them to me at letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com. You might even hear your story in the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations for just $1 a month on Patreon. And maybe even pick up some Let's Read merch on Spreadshirt. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all these stories in long compilation form and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links down below. Thanks so much, friends. And have an amazing and safe 4th of July.